The whispers started small, just a few murmurs here and there. A curious glance. A knowing smirk. Then, suddenly, it was everywhere. Her name on everyone's lips. People watching her every move, speculating, wondering. How had she done it? How had she transformed overnight into the woman no one could stop talking about? If he had ever bothered to really look at her before, he might have seen it coming. But that was the thing he never had. She had always been there, patient, loyal, waiting for the day he would truly see her. Not just as an afterthought. Not as someone who would always be around, no matter how much he overlooked her. He had taken her presence for granted, assuming she would never change. But people did change. And she had changed in ways no one could have predicted. It wasn't sudden, not really. The shift had begun the moment she realized she was tired of waiting. Tired of being an option instead of a priority. Tired of dimming her own light, just so his could shine brighter. She had spent years making herself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. But the moment she stopped, everything changed. At first, he didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own world, too used to her fading into the background. The missed calls, the unanswered messages, he barely registered them. And why would he? She had always been there before. Always waiting. But then one day, she wasn't. He saw it before he understood it. The way people turned when she walked into a room. The way conversations hushed as she passed by, curiosity flashing in every eye. There was something different about her. A confidence that hadn't been there before. A spark that had been reignited. And suddenly, she wasn't just the girl who had been there. She was the woman everyone wanted to know. It was in the way she carried herself now, head high, eyes steady, unbothered by the past that had once held her back. She no longer needed validation from anyone, least of all from him. The world had finally noticed her, and this time she noticed us too. And that was the part he hadn't expected. That was what unsettled him the most. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of her world. And now, he was the one left watching from the sidelines. That first moment of realization hit him like a slow-moving wave, subtle at first, then undeniable. He hadn't thought much of her absence in the beginning. She had always been around, always the one reaching out, making the effort. If she was a little distant now, maybe she was just busy. Maybe she'd come around. But then the shift became impossible to ignore. He would see her in places she never used to go, surrounded by people who weren't part of their usual circle. She moved differently, with a quiet certainty, a self-assuredness that hadn't been there before. She wasn't seeking approval, wasn't waiting for anyone to notice her. And yet, somehow, everyone did. The first time he saw her at an event without him, it was jarring. He had never realized how much he'd come to expect her presence beside him. She was always the steady one, the familiar shadow lingering in the background while he took center stage. Now the roles had shifted. She was the one people gravitated toward. He watched as she laughed with someone he barely recognized, head tilted back, eyes shining. When was the last time he had seen her like that? He told himself it was nothing. A phase, a brief moment of change. But then, it kept happening. Again and again. The messages he had once ignored were no longer there, replaced with silence. The invitations she used to extend without fail gone. For the first time, he was the one left waiting, wondering where she was, who she was with. People started talking. He could hear them, the way they whispered about how much she had changed. It wasn't just the way she dressed, though that had shifted to bolder colors, styles that suited her newfound confidence. It was the way she carried herself, the way she no longer hesitated before speaking, no longer softened her words to make others comfortable. He told himself it didn't matter, that he was fine, unaffected. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more it became clear he had never truly seen her before. Not the way he should have. Now she was everywhere, yet somehow more unreachable than ever. At first, he told himself that he was only noticing her more because she was suddenly everywhere. It wasn't that she had changed, he was just paying attention for the first time in a long while. That was all. But the more he watched, the harder it was to believe his own excuses. She hadn't just changed. She had evolved. It wasn't just about her presence in new spaces, or the way people looked at her now. It was something deeper. The way she carried herself, the effortless way she engaged with those around her, the confidence in her voice when she spoke. It was like watching a different version of the person he had once known, and yet, somehow, this version had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to step forward. The realization unsettled him. How had he missed it? How had he overlooked everything she was capable of for so long? He had always assumed she would be there, steady and reliable, fitting into the quiet space he had assigned her. He had taken for granted the way she had always supported him, always put him first, never asking for more than he was willing to give. And now, when he finally turned to look, she was already gone. The whispers around town only made it worse. People talked about her success, the way she was thriving in ways no one had expected. Those who had once overlooked her were now desperate to be in her presence, hanging on to her words, seeking her approval. And worst of all, she didn't seem to notice him anymore. He tried to tell himself it was for the best. He had no reason to feel this way after all. He had been the one who had walked away first. But now, for the first time, he found himself questioning if he had ever truly known what he wanted. Because watching her now, seeing her step into the spotlight, in a way he had never imagined, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He told himself he would move on. It was the logical thing to do. She had. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. But no matter how much he tried to push the thoughts away, they clung to him, growing heavier with every passing day. The town was buzzing with her name. Every conversation seemed to circle back to her, how she had turned things around, how she had become someone people admired, someone they wanted to be around. It wasn't just success, it was the way she carried herself, like she had finally stepped into the life she was always meant for. And he was no longer part of it. At first, he convinced himself it was just curiosity that made him seek her out. He told himself it was harmless, just a way to understand how she had changed so much, so fast. But the moment he saw her up close, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. She was radiant, her confidence unshakable, her laughter effortless. And for the first time, he saw her without the version of himself that had once defined her. She wasn't looking for him in the crowd, wasn't waiting for his approval, wasn't tied to the memories they had shared. She was simply living without him. It should have been enough to make him walk away. He had done this. He had let her go. But now, watching her surrounded by people who saw her in a way he never had, a gnawing feeling took root in his chest. Regret. The kind that wasn't just fleeting. The kind that stayed. The kind that made him wonder if he had lost something he would never get back. And then he saw it someone else at her side. Someone who hadn't taken her for granted. Someone who hadn't waited until it was too late. And for the first time, fear settled in his bones. What if he really had lost her forever? He told himself to walk away. It was the logical thing to do. But logic had stopped mattering the moment he saw her with someone else. His chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt before, a mix of emotions he couldn't untangle: regret, jealousy, and something deeper, something closer to fear. She was happy. That much was clear. The way she smiled, the way she carried herself, it wasn't forced, wasn't for show. It was real. And for the first time, he wondered if she had ever been this happy when she was with him. He turned to leave, telling himself he had no right to be here, that this wasn't his life anymore. But just as he took a step back, something caught his attention. A shift in her expression. It was subtle, Barely noticeable, but it was there. Her laughter had softened, her gaze flickering to the side, as if she was suddenly somewhere else in her mind. Something wasn't right. The man beside her leaned in, whispering something in her ear. She nodded, her smile returning, but there was a hesitation in her movements now, like she was playing a role she wasn't entirely comfortable with. It was the first crack in the perfect picture he had built in his head. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. She turned her attention back to the conversation, her voice light and easy, as if nothing had happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was imagining things. But something told him there was more to the story than what he had been seeing from a distance. His hands clenched at his sides. He had no right to interfere. He had been the one to let her go. But suddenly, the thought of leaving, of never knowing what was really going on, felt impossible. Maybe he had lost her. Or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over yet. His breath hitched as her words sank in. She had waited for him. Even after everything, she had held on until she couldn't anymore. The weight of his own mistakes pressed down on him, making it hard to find the right words. But words weren't enough now. Not anymore. She turned away, as if bracing herself for him to leave again. But this time, he didn't. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought maybe you'd be better off without me." Her fingers curled into fists, a silent battle waging within her. "And now? Now I know I was a fool." A long silence stretched between them. The sounds of the bustling restaurant, the laughter and clinking glasses, all faded into the background. In this moment, it was just the two of them. He could see it then, the way her defenses wavered, how she wanted to believe him, but couldn't risk breaking all over again. "You left," she finally whispered, "and I had to pick up the pieces." His throat tightened. "I know." She shook her head, stepping back. "I don't know if I can do this again." Before he could respond, the other man, her supposed new beginning, approached, his expression unreadable. He placed a hand on her shoulder, almost possessively, and gave him a tight smile. "I think you've had enough time," he said, his tone polite but firm. She flinched at his touch, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. He met her gaze again. "Is this what you really want?" She hesitated. Her silence spoke volumes. The other man tightened his grip, his smile slipping. "She's with me now. Move on." For the first time, he saw it clearly, the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just hesitation. It was something deeper, something she had been trying to hide. He clenched his fists. "Are you happy?" he asked her directly. She didn't answer. The other man scoffed. "This is ridiculous. We're leaving." He pulled her closer, but this time she resisted. And then, finally, she spoke. "No." The single word cut through the air like a knife. She pulled away from the other man, taking a step toward him instead. Her breath was unsteady, but her voice was strong. "I'm done pretending. I'm done settling." The other man's expression darkened. "You don't mean that." She lifted her chin. "I do." For a moment, there was only tension, a quiet but dangerous shift in the air. Then, with a frustrated sigh, the other man turned on his heel and walked away. And just like that, it was over. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging, as if the weight of everything she had been carrying was finally lifted. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out but stopping just short. "Are you okay?" She met his eyes, a small, bittersweet smile forming on her lips. "I think I will be." And for the first time in a long time, hope flickered between them. She stood there, the weight of her decision settling over her like a long overdue realization. The noise of the world around them faded, replaced by a quiet certainty between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't running from him, from herself, from the life she had tried so hard to rebuild. He watched her carefully, hesitant to say too much, afraid that one wrong word might shatter this fragile moment. But then she smiled, small, tentative, but real. "I don't know where this leaves us," she admitted. He nodded, understanding. "Me neither. But I know I don't want to walk away again." A deep breath filled her lungs, like she was letting go of something that had been suffocating her for too long. "I don't want you to." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was something. And right now, that was enough. Over the next few days, things didn't magically fall into place. There were still moments of doubt, of hesitation. He gave her space, never pushing, only showing up when she let him. She was relearning how to trust him, and he was proving that he was worth trusting. She spent time alone too, rediscovering parts of herself she had buried beneath years of trying to be who others wanted her to be. She made decisions for herself, not out of obligation or fear, but because she finally had the strength to choose. And slowly, piece by piece, she felt like herself again. One evening, as they walked along the quiet streets of the city, she finally asked the question that had been lingering between them. "Why did you leave back then?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I was scared. Of failing you. Of not being enough. I convinced myself you'd be better off without me." She studied him for a long moment. "And now?" "I know I was wrong," he said simply. "You weren't better off without me. And I sure as hell wasn't better off without you." A breeze moved between them, carrying away some of the heaviness that had always surrounded that memory. She nodded slowly, understanding now that his leaving had never been about her, not being enough. It had been about him, not believing he was. And that made all the difference. Time passed. Healing wasn't linear, but they took steps toward it every day. They laughed again, shared quiet moments, and rebuilt what had once been lost, not by trying to go back to the past, but by moving forward into something new. Her name was no longer whispered in town as a woman left behind. Instead, she became someone people admired, someone who had found her own way, her own voice. And somewhere along the way, he realized that loving her wasn't about proving himself, it was about standing beside her, no matter what. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "So what now?" She smiled, squeezing his hand just a little tighter. "We take it one day at a time." And this time, neither of them walked away.